I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Amy Jacoba to the School of Theology this summer. Dr. Jacoba is a scholar specializing in particular the area of adolescents and teenagers dealing with disability. Dr. Jacoba is a professor at Ottawa University. She deals with practical theology. She's an author, speaker, particularly on the subject of disability. Dr. Jacoba holds degrees from University of Arizona, Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, Arizona State University, has a PhD in practical theology from Fuller Theological Seminary. She also taught many years at Truett Theological Seminary, and Dr. Jacoba, I was in that area myself at Baylor University, Sikkim Bears, and I enjoyed the Waco community. I'm glad you were there. For many years, over 20 years, Dr. Jacoba has been a sought-out teacher and lecturer at universities, colleges, and nonprofits throughout the United States and internationally. She's an author of several articles and books, particularly in the area of disability, one that says, Redefining Perfect, the interplay between theology and disability. She's currently the lead pastor at a trauma-informed congregation in Phoenix, Arizona. Phoenix, Arizona is her hometown, home area. Dr. Jacoba excels in the connection of her core beliefs and practical action, how she wants to bridge theology and practice, putting these together. She also practices this in her own home, with her own family, with her husband, her 3 children, and she tells us she has a very active dog that keeps you busy. Dr. Jacoba enjoys hiking, cooking, playing board games, and today the title of her lecture is Enabling Faith, Ministry with Children and Teens in a Disabling World. I'm pleased to welcome to the Summer School of Theology, Dr. Amy Elizabeth Jacoba.
Well, that's quite an introduction. Thank you so very, very much. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening for wherever you might happen to be. The sun has just risen here just a short bit ago. So it is definitely morning in my part of the world. I'm profoundly grateful to be here. I absolutely am going to be talking about teenagers and children and what that looks like. I will say one other quick note that is going to feel a little bit on the side of this is that at least certainly in my own personal life, but then also through almost 3 decades of doing ministry in this realm, increasingly what we're seeing are young people either with disabilities or young people helping family members with disabilities. And so it becomes a slightly different conversation when you have somebody who's 14 and is now fulfilling the role of caregiver. And so it's a big picture of what we're going to be doing. Let me go ahead and do a quick screen share so that we can kind of follow along with what I have planned, and quite frankly, so that I don't just go awry. Goodness knows where we could end up if I am left to my own devices. I'm gonna scoot us all down here. So Roger has very, very graciously given a lovely introduction. Where I want to begin first, quite frankly, is with a prayer. And it's a prayer for this time, but it's also a prayer for us. And I will also share, if you can see this little book, and I'll put it in a chat. My colleague, Orena Evans, has written this. It's fantastic because it's the most brutally honest prayers and reflections for families with disabilities. But it's a lot of her prayers are things like, God, I don't like today. I know we're not supposed to say that out loud, but this is hard. Or, wow, I got to cut in line because I have a disability. Thank you for the little perks. And so it tends to be a lovely, very honest reflection. But if you would be so kind as to pray with me. When we are faced with uncertainty, God, we really like the illusion that we are in control. But this situation has punctured that illusion. Teach us that even when we can't see the next steps, you are beside us. Teach us that we can trust you to stay with us. Teach us how to live with uncertainty. Give us wisdom and knowledge as constant variables swirl around us. Increase our assurance of your presence. In your changeless name, amen. I want to start out helping you get your mind in the kind of same frame of an adolescent. I want for you to think of what was your most favorite formative song or movie from your youth. That one that maybe you haven't heard in, for some of you, 10 years. For some of us, it may be more like 40 years. You don't have to confess which time frame it's in, but is there a song that you haven't heard in a really long time, but when it comes on, you know all the words and you think, why is that still in my mind? How did that get stuck there? Or when you hear about a movie, you can still quote those lines. Are you with me? Do you have something in your head? Thank you. See a few nods. So during our formative years, there are these things that end up sticking with us. I have long said, argued that how we understand God during our formative years, during kind of late childhood on into middle adolescence and emerging adulthood, that's often who we understand God to be for the rest of our lives. Verses you memorized, lessons you learned when you were 15 or 16 that you think you've long forgotten, when you're 35 or 45 or 55 and facing a crisis, all of a sudden you're right back to that lesson, that concept, something that sticks with you. And I've actually done a lot of research in and around this. I'm not necessarily presenting research in that area this morning, but what I do want for you to know is this deeply important formative time of adolescence shifts how you handle things for the rest of your lives. If you are told you have value and worth when you're young, no teenager will say out loud, oh, I absolutely believe that, because they're teenagers and because cross-culturally teenagers struggle. But if they're told that over and over and over again, then there's that peace when life gets difficult. One of the things that I am going to try to do today is talk about impairments. And I often use the term impairments as opposed to disability, although I'll use them interchangeably today. When we're talking about impairments, those are the things that we often have labeled as disabilities. But the reality is everybody's going to encounter an impairment at some point in time. Some people are born with them. Some acquire them through accident or injury or horrific situations. And some of us acquire them through age. And so our baseline understanding that we teach when people are young matters, because that's what they take into their lives and into adulthood. And so the slide that I am showing, where I even asked the question about a song, off to the right, this is a picture that I actually took. It's not a stock photo. It was when I was camping with my kids. I grew up in the desert. It's hot. If any of you have ever seen any pictures of kind of stereotypical desert, it's probably what it looks like where I live. We have saguaro cactus everywhere. They're the ones with the arms. It is indeed dusty and dry. We have the most beautiful sunsets on the planet, in my opinion. And I think it's a gift from the Lord, but it's also because we have a lot of dust. And so what looks ugly and not particularly helpful creates some of the most spectacular scenes. And I was thinking about this. I heard the lecture 2 days ago about terrible beauty, and it's stuck with me as I look out in so many places in our world. What looks repulsive, what looks distasteful, perhaps on the surface, when you pause, you begin to see glimmers of where the Holy Spirit is at work, of where there is something beautiful that is taking place. And so I'm going to invite us to think back through what were some of the things that you were taught when you were young about who God is, about who you are, being created in the image of God. What are some of those things that maybe you had to relearn as an adult or unlearn? And what are the words you choose moving forward? When it comes to children's and youth ministry in any sense, really it's hard to do it without thinking through some theoretical approaches. There are lots and lots of different ways to be able to do this. For today, I'm letting you know I lean into one that is known as positive youth development. It comes from positive psychology, and Martin Seligman is the person who has done the greatest amount of work in this area to initially bring it into the field of counseling. But Peter Benson is the man who really brought it into an understanding of youth ministry. He was one of the founders, and he was the CEO for an organization called Search Institute. Some of you may have heard of Search Institute. It's here in the United States, but they've done work around the world. They're the largest organization researching adolescence and making it accessible. I can tell you a few other organizations that also research adolescence, but they work for places like Coca-Cola. And so to even get their research, and I'm really not kidding, you have to pay $25,000, $30,000 US just to read a research paper. Now, I don't know who their researchers are that are getting paid that much, but that's not normal. Search Institute has nearly 4 decades of really, really honing in and saying, what does it look like to do good work with young people? Peter Benson's core belief was rooted in Christianity. He believed deeply that all young people were made in the image of God. Consequently, all young people deserved the best opportunity at having a healthy life. So if you look at the website and the works they provide, it's not always blatantly Christian, because he believed that whether you were a follower of Jesus or not, you deserved good. That said, they also have an entire section that is about spiritual formation, and in particular, it's going to come from a Christian perspective. But positive youth development has 6 major characteristics. The first one is competence. And this one would say that young people, and when I'm saying young people, I usually am talking about kind of first thirds of life, but at least late childhood, which I know some of you are working with. I can talk about early childhood development as well. For those of you who are doing children's ministry, early childhood, they need to know God exists and God loves them. That's really kind of core foundational beliefs. Part of that is who they are developmentally. Part of that is because that's really kind of the foundation of who we are as a people. As they start getting into elementary school, secondary school for some of you, when they hit about ages 8 to about 24, that's really kind of the window that I am talking about. But positive youth development already takes the premise and leans heavily into that young people are made in the image of God. They don't have to be redeemed. They don't have to be fixed. There's not something wrong with them and we've got to get them to that better place. Instead, it's, no, you already are made in the image of God. Now we get to do a little bit of work about what that's going to mean for you and how do you live that out, but also how do you internalize that and learn what you already are. And so we talk about competence. Competence refers to a sense of capability in specific areas. This might be being incredibly competent in knowing every musician out there. It might be that you're incredibly competent. One of the youth I work with right now, he is 14. He knows more about space and rockets than any person I know. And part of that is when you are working with young people with a variety of disabilities, then there are times when for some of them, their comfort zone becomes being obsessed with something in particular. And so I share this because you would think knowing about rockets is not necessarily the most helpful when it comes to youth ministry. But when you have a young man who feels incompetent in so many other areas, he gets to come every single week to youth group and say, let me tell you something new. I know more about amateur rocketry than I ever thought I was going to in my entire life. Because he knows a lot and he gets to teach me and share with me. Competence can also come in academic realms. It can come in social realms. When we have young people with impairments, they're often in that space of really looking around and saying, here's where I fall short. But what if we said, but where do you excel? That's a difference. And when I'm talking about, and this is when as I started putting this whole lecture together, I realized there's almost too much to cover in this very, very short amount of time. And so I am owning that there are times where I'm talking about physical disabilities. There are times when I am talking about cognitive. There are times when I am talking about emotional. And so I'm going to try to continue to use examples rather than saying, here are the 10 things you need to do for doing ministry with teens and children with disabilities. I wanted to give you a framework and then for you to begin thinking through the specifics of young people that are in your world. But this idea of competence, it also means that this is applicable across the board, whether a young person has a disability or not. All young people need to feel like they have something where they're actually capable in that particular area. The next one is confidence. This idea that they have self-efficacy, that they have self-worth. And so we invite them to practice their competence. And instead of saying, oh, I know how to do that better, it means that we as the adults have to kind of hold our tongue at times and allow them to excel. The fourth one is connection. And connection is positive reciprocal relationships. A lot of young people with impairments, they have professionals in their lives. They have a doctor, they have a physical therapist, they have a teacher, they have a parent or a caregiver. They have people in their lives, but they don't have peers. They have people who are present, but they don't have somebody with whom they get to be friends. You've heard a lot about friendship in the last few days. It's so key when we look at ministry with those with disabilities. But I would also argue, quite frankly, it's key for all of us. A lot of adults at this point know a lot of people, but they don't really have a lot of friends. And so if we can keep that in mind when we're working with young people and go, wait a minute, what does it look like? Maybe we don't always need to be just pouring into them. Maybe we don't need to always be molding them or shaping them or getting them to memorize or learn Bible or that prayer. What if we just said, how you doing? What's your day like? What if we then also teach them to ask that of other people? A lot of young people with disabilities end up in a space of being so enclosed that they forget to lift their head. Now, again, I said, I've got enough material to cover a few days. So I'm going to throw a few things in that I didn't necessarily plan. But when we look in scripture and we look at the Hebrew Bible and we look at the New Testament and we look at the word sin, there are a couple of different ways. Probably the most popular way of understanding sin is missing the mark as if it's a target and you get slightly off. But there's another term for sin that actually talks about being so self-focused that you no longer pay attention to the world. You become the center of your world instead of God being the center of your world. That's a common thing that happens for a young person with a disability, whether they were born with it or acquired. Their teachers, their families, their siblings, people around them end up saying, what do we need to do for you? How do we accommodate you? What do we adjust for you? Instead of, this is who we are together, but we can all lift our heads where Christ is the center. That idea of connection is, instead of them always being the exception and the center of everything, it's a reciprocal relationship where we value them and and invite them into friendship. The next one is character. This one is morality, integrity. It's also adherence to social norms. This one is an interesting one because we want to invite young people to have good character. Sometimes this is awkward. And there are times where I will often say in youth ministry, I'll be awkward so that you don't have to. I work with a lot of teenagers. Again, cross-culturally, teenagers, they have a lot of hormones. They're very excited about what it means to grow up to be a man or a woman. And sometimes they are underestimated. And so we will have to talk with some of our students about very simple things. When you're going to give somebody a hug, you need to do a side hug and you need to put your arm on their shoulder. And Senya, I'm realizing this may have been a word you may need to help translate, but I'll be awkward, so nobody else has to. A lot of young people, they will end up trying to grope, which means touching inappropriately, in part because nobody's ever told them not to. They have hormones, they've seen movies, they've seen TV shows, and they haven't had someone. I would argue that one of the kindest things that we can do for adolescents is to correct them in love. We don't want to shame them. We don't need to belittle them, but it is okay to say, hey, did you know that that's not an appropriate way to touch someone? Let's practice a better way. And that's not something that generally you discuss in seminary when you're studying to be in ministry. But if you are working with teenagers with disabilities, it's learning what's appropriate touch and not appropriate touch. It's learning to invite them to be honest. It's learning to invite them into a space of integrity and character. The next one is to be caring, to have empathy toward others. This one simply is, you're not the center of the world. Maybe pay attention if somebody's crying next to you. It's paying attention to the leaders around you. So there's a lot that's written on all of these, but for me, it all points to the final one. And this is the one that's been added to positive youth development. but it's the idea of a contribution. A contribution means that our children and our young people with impairments, we get to be the people that help them find opportunities to serve, to contribute, and to contribute meaningfully. Don't give them the job nobody else wants to do. Don't have them simply greet if that's just kind of a sad space that nobody else actually wants. Contribution means getting to know them so that they can actually be able to give back in ways that are meaningful and profound. So with that, I mentioned Peter Benson, and he was the one who really started Search Institute and set its agenda. He has a quote where he says, "Youth are not vessels to be filled, but fires to be lit." Rather than our anxiety coming and saying, I need to teach this young person, and I'll know that they're okay if they can say back to me all of the things that I think they should know. Instead, what if we got to know them? What if we poured into them in ways that are profound? So how do we do this? What does it mean to light a fire? Metaphorically, we're not really setting our kids on fire. That idea of finding out, what are they passionate about? What are they interested in? For a lot of young people in general, but in particular for our friends with disabilities, they are accustomed to somebody coming along and asking them, what pains do you have physically? How can I help you? Which is always lovely and kind and best of intention, but it's often, what can I do for you? Not who are you? Not what excites you? Not what is it that you love? Not how did God make you? And so there's one other developmental theoretical approach. This is from a man named William Glasser, and it's called choice theory. And he goes through 5 different things that all young people need. The first is going to be safety, security, survival. This can be incredibly difficult. This runs the gamut from the snacks that you are providing. Did they cause an allergic reaction in a young person? Teens and children with impairments and disabilities often have food allergies that other kids don't. And so they are frequently ones you'll think that you're bringing a snack for your group, and then they show up and they can't have anything. Now, by the time they're in middle school, by the time they're kind of 10, 11, 12 years old, this has happened so many times, you often won't even hear them complain. But they're internalizing, oh, I'm not part of the group. I'm not somebody that somebody has thought about ahead of time. That safety, security, survival is also, is the space you are in, is it a safe space for them? Can they move about safely? One of the things that we talk about is, if you have a physical space where you get to meet regularly, then you probably need to do an audit to be certain that mobility is accessible for everyone. And that's everything from a ramp for a wheelchair to, do you have furniture pushed back if you have somebody who walks with braces or needs a little extra room. Now, I'm acutely aware, and quite frankly, I was really, and still am, really nervous to be talking to this group in particular, because you're facing some safety and security issues that, quite frankly, most of us don't face regularly in ministry. And so this ongoing conversation of what it looks like to be able to have stability as much as possible, to have regularity as much as possible, but also to be really honest with the young people when it's not. The concept of freedom, this one is really the idea of just giving them choices. It isn't that they're free to do anything, but it does mean that you're not coming in and dictating everything. It's approaching them and saying, I've got these 3 games. Is there a game you would like to play? It's asking the teenagers in your world, what snacks do you like? What food do you like? Instead of you just deciding. It's saying, what questions do you have? Instead of you coming in and saying, here's what I think you should know about God. It's giving them some space to be able to say, I don't even want to do Bible study today. It's been a terrible week. Can we just talk? Now, adult anxiety says, but what if this is an important time and I really need to teach you this important truth? Well, I think ministry in big picture, youth ministry, and certainly youth ministry with teens with disabilities, we need to lean into the Holy Spirit a little bit more, because sometimes I think the Holy Spirit is guiding us to just be present with one another instead of always feeling like we need to push through our agenda. The next one is power. This one is the desire to be respected. I want to be able to have some autonomy. Some say, I don't want you to see me as just a project. I don't want you to see me as somebody to only be pitied. I want you to be able to see me as somebody who also is created fully in the image of God. And so we want to be able to come alongside and let them know that they matter and that their contributions matter. It means if you invite them to create some art that's going to be used in a worship service, don't fix it later. If you don't think it looks flawless or amazing, who cares? They're contributing what they actually have brought to the table. If you have a young person who loves to sing and asks to sing in your worship service, and you know that maybe it's going to be slightly off, who cares? Because this is a space where they can contribute meaningfully something that they have brought to the table, and it's done with excellence. Now, that said, it also means that you may need to say, let's practice. Let's help you be the best you can be, because we want to offer our best to the Lord. It also means that you may need to do some coaching in your communities, because I promise, if you invite a young person with Down syndrome who might sing a little bit off key, somebody somewhere is going to complain and they're going to say it was inappropriate. And you get to be that person who comes alongside and says, tell me about that. Why was that inappropriate? This person too has been made in the image of God. This person too has contributions to make. So there's a lot I could say about that. Love and belonging goes back to reciprocal relationships. Young people just want to know that somebody cares that they exist. They want to talk about books they're reading. They want to talk about their favorite songs. They probably want to talk about Taylor Swift, either because they love her or they don't love her. I have 3 kids. I have a divided house. It's an ongoing conversation. I'm convinced my son doesn't like Taylor Swift simply because my daughter loves Taylor Swift. That's going to happen in any group, and that's age appropriate. The final one is fun. One, I think we all need a little more fun, and humor and fun, it is culturally bound. So you're going to be able to tell what is fun in your settings, perhaps more than I can. But please don't underestimate the sense of fun only airing on what Bible study or what theology or what traditions do I need to pass on. We all need a little bit of a break. And so sometimes playing games is the holiest thing you can do. Now, when you're working with teens with disabilities, it also means that you may have to be a little bit creative. I mentioned I live here in Arizona. It's very hot here. And so one of the things that we do in the summertime is it's a game of catch with water balloons. but the balloons we use because so many of our friends have latex allergies. Latex is often what's used in rubber gloves or in hospitals. A lot of kids with disabilities have latex allergies. And so we have refillable water balloons, and we use them for water balloon toss outside. They get wet, they get to cool off, they get to throw water balloons at their leaders, but they're not breaking out in allergies. And it means that one of the things that we had to do is, I'm going to tell you now, they're more expensive than regular balloons, but we don't have to rebuy them. We get to use them over and over and over again. But we're also not playing a game where we say, look, 20 of you get to participate, but the 2 of you can watch and cheer. No kid wants to watch and cheer. That's not fun, no matter how happy we make it sound. Unless they are choosing to watch and cheer, we want to create games and activities that are going to be open to every single child. Let me add one more little piece to this. When you're doing ministry with children or teens with disabilities, when you're thinking about games and topics, do your very best to do ones that are age appropriate. What happens for a lot, children's ministry ends up being a little bit easier because, quite frankly, they're younger. But for a lot of adolescent ministry and youth ministry and on into our young adults, they will end up being treated like children because they're trying to have simple concepts. And we mistake simple concepts with childlike. Even if they cannot verbalize that they have a crush on someone, that they're wondering if they're ever going to get married, that they're annoyed with their teacher and they don't want to do homework. That's part of what is happening when you get to really know young people. Just because they are 15 or 16 and they come up and they really, really still love a cartoon, or they have an obsession about something that seems childlike, they are also experiencing the exact same things. I was doing camp and there was a young man with a speaker board, and people would talk to him like he was 5. Hey, buddy, how you doing, kiddo? And he was always polite and he would say hello. And as I got to know him and he was using his speaker board, he said, I imagine the people who talk to me as if I'm a small child, I imagine them to be very, very stupid, and they can't do any better. And I thought, oh, that was his coping skill. And then I said, well, what would you like to talk about? And he said, I'd like to talk about the person I have a crush on. And I thought, then let's talk about that. And then it switched to, I'd like to tell you about my favorite movie. And then it switched to, I'd like to ask you, why did God make it so my voice doesn't work? It started out with him being annoyed and being given space to just vent and be, a normal kid. And it shifted to, where is God in my life when I have a body like this? Okay. I've got several things to get through and I want to be certain we have time for conversation. So I'm going to start moving a little faster. So where does faith come in? In the smallest details and in the biggest ways that you can imagine. And here's what I mean by this. When we look at the creation story, I've already mentioned Imago Dei, but we have creation in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I think it's incredibly helpful to remember that the Bible is about God and it is not a science book. Genesis 1, when it talks about, and God spoke this and it was created and it was good, and God spoke that and it was created and it was good. God is far away and it's big. God has a bigger plan than any of us can imagine. And God, the creator of the universe, who flung the stars into the sky and created all kinds of weird animals and things in the ocean that I don't understand, is huge. But we get to Genesis 2, and what we see is that God is down on the earth and in the dust and breathes into the dust life. God is close. God is in your face. You can feel God's breath on you. And so God is both concerned with the details, concerned with our bodies, concerned with what is going well and not, but also there is a much bigger picture out there. And so inviting young people into that story and recognizing that there's a lot more, there's a lot more to this. Let's see if I can, there we go. So one of the ways that I like to think about this as well, this idea of faith, this is Deuteronomy 6:4-9, and it's the Shema. It's a very, very, very popular, common passage of scripture. And there are lots of ways where I could exegete this and we could have a conversation, but there are a couple in particular that I want to focus on. Where it says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone," or maybe you've heard "the Lord is one." This was when the Israelites were reckoning with the others around them, the Babylonians and the Akkadians, and saying, wait a minute, our God is one. This is our God. It says, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. Keep these words I am commanding you today in your heart. Recite them to your children. Talk about them when you are at home and when you are away, when you lie down and when you rise. Bind them as a sign on your hand. Fix them as an emblem on your forehead. Write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates." Now, here's why I think this is important. When we look at this in Hebrew, it says, love the Lord your God with all your heart. This is your emotion. This is that thing that you can kind of feel. And then it also, when it talks about this in the term that's actually used in Hebrew, it isn't just emotion, but it's feeling, but it's connecting your mind and your heart. When you read this later in Matthew, it gets quoted again. It'll say your heart, mind, and soul. Here, the term in Hebrew is really connecting this kind of bodily mind, emotion piece in that one word, heart. With all your soul is kind of that which continues on. But here's what I think is important when it says, "and all your might." That's a weird word. It's a weird word in English. It's a weird word if you translate it into any other language apart from Hebrew, because what it really is love God with all your very. The Hebrew term, it's be'om, but it's this strange word. And so often in our churches, and I mean across traditions, whether you are Protestant, Orthodox, or Catholic, we have a love affair at this point in history with cognitive. What do you know? How can you recite? Can you put this back out there? For some of our Pentecostal brothers and sisters, they're a lot less interested in what can you recite, but what do you feel? Some of you may have heard my husband lecture earlier this week. We talk a lot about our understandings of things, and there are times when we both kind of feel like bad ministers, because I go to church and I don't necessarily feel the presence of God. Now, you're not supposed to say that out loud, but I just don't. And so what do you do with that? Has God left? No. What I love in this particular passage, when it talks about these different ways of encountering God, it's actually called a merism. In when you do biblical studies, It's talking about kind of from A to Z, the beginning to the end, and everything in between. Love God with your mind if you're that more intellectual person. Love God with your heart, your emotions if you're more emotional. Love God with your actions if that's who you are. It is all, we're intended to love God with all that we are. This matters for teens and children with disabilities, because for some of them, when we value memorizing scripture or knowing stories, and they simply, that's just not a part of what they're going to be able to do, they recognize when other people are, and they can feel less than. And so it's this ongoing conversation. I hope for some of you, I was an adult when I kind of came across this and learned, wait a minute, I don't always have to be emotional, or sometimes I don't want to have to be as much in my head. And God is saying, I already knew you. I made you. It's okay. Love me exactly as you are, because that's what I want, is for you to thrive and be the best that you can be. This plays out in a couple of different ways. We make the road by walking. So we invite our children and teens with disabilities to actually be able to live this faith thing out. We offer patterns at first. This is your liturgy. This is when you are in church and you say the same things, or it's in a particular order and it becomes familiar and comfortable. I was at camp a couple of years ago, and we had a young woman who is autistic, and she happened to be in a cabin with a lot of kids who didn't go to church much or ever. And it came to time to do Eucharist. And the kids in her cabin were not always the nicest to her. She would ask questions, she would interrupt. And so it was this ongoing conversation all week long of how do we interact well. And then it came to Eucharist, and she's sitting with her cabin, and she knew every single word of the Great Thanksgiving. She knew every call and response. She knew every bow and when to cross. And the girls in her cabin at cabin time that night said, when did you study that? How do you know this? And she laughed and she said, I hate school. I've never studied this. And they said, how do you know it? And she said, because I do it. I've been doing this my whole life. It's a part of who I am. And so the fancy way of saying it is lex orandi, lex credende. So you pray, so you believe. When we invite young people into the space of the patterns and the liturgy and the traditions, it forms and shapes them. We then get to that space where we get to invite them to practice living it out in their schools, at their homes. Sometimes in the youth group I lead, we role play. And we'll try, what happens when somebody's saying something terrible or sexist or racist? How can you stand up for somebody else? And so I have young people with intellectual disabilities who will say, but I'm the one who gets made fun of. And I'll say, yeah, I know you are. And I hope somebody stands up for you. But have you ever thought about standing up for someone else? About stepping in and saying, hey, that's not okay. And we practice so that they're not always the ones that need to be protected. They're now in reciprocal relationships. We invite them to reflect, to ponder. And I think importantly, then the final piece is we invite them to performance. Now, I want to be careful. This isn't performance just for the sake of performance. This is, what does it look like for them to do something meaningful within the community? This is, are they chalice bearers for Eucharist? This is saying, what would it look like for you to be a full member of a ministry that is reaching out to someone else? This is, have you actually ever thought about being in ministry yourself? That's a longer conversation. I've actually been now emailing back and forth with somebody I met 2 days ago at this very conference, who knows that he's called, who knows that he is priestly. And sometimes it's received well by the bishop and sometimes it is not. But increasingly, we're having the conversation of what does it look like for you to be able to be the one who is serving instead of just the one who is receiving. So let me make it a little more concrete for you for kids. We talk about discipleship. I have a brilliant friend and colleague. Her name is Suzanne Williams. She works primarily with teens with intellectual disabilities. And when she has the group of them and they are doing discipleship, she invites them. And then I've openly told her that I've now just stolen this from her because good youth ministry is stealing good ideas. She invites the young people in her group to create a project, and they take almost a full year to think about it, to pray about it, to research it. But the project must do one of three things. It must honor God, or serve others, or build faith. And so they talk about discipleship as something that isn't just something that's going to, it's not a one-time kind of thing, like I went and served somewhere, therefore I'm a disciple. It's how do you weave that into your life and how do you think about it and how do you invite others in? And so probably my favorite story from that particular one, she had a young woman who loved to sing and loved to dance. For any of you who may be working with teens with intellectual disabilities, dance parties are often the way to go. It's amazing how often you can dance. But she loved to sing and dance, and she wanted to make a recording of worship songs. Now, the reality is her voice was not always on key. But she said, I don't care. I want to learn. And so the group of people around her said, well, what would it look like for us to get you singing lessons? How do we choose songs? How do you record a song? Well, fast forward the story. She took 1.5 years to work on 3 songs. They ended up recording them. They put them out so others could have them. And then when she did her CD release party, admission to the release party was a stuffed animal. And the reason for that is another young woman in her group, she decided her project was to collect stuffed animals and deliver them back to the hospital that had helped her when she was a child. She couldn't afford to buy a bunch of stuffed animals. So she talked to the hospital about the regulations and safety and cleanliness. Then they put that out, and that was a way for them to work together. So at one girl's CD release party of worship songs, the other girl was collecting stuffed animals to then donate to a hospital. They worked together to be able to do their projects, and all of it was ways to be able to say, what does it look like to serve others instead of me always being the one receiving? Let me say a quick word in a group when you have the needs of young people clashing. You can look this passage up. It's a familiar passage. It's, when does the eye say, I don't need the foot? What if the foot says, I don't need the head? Here's the reality of working with some young people. Sometimes you will have young people who need a lot of stimulation. You will have young people in your group who might rock, who might move their hands. It's called stimming. They may actually make noises or call out. And it can be very nerve-wracking. It can be very anxious-making for some people. But it's something where they bodily need to be in a space that helps to keep them calm and focused. You might then also have somebody who needs absolute stillness and quiet. And so my esteemed colleague, Leon, Van Ohm, we were talking about this a couple of weeks ago, about a month and a half ago, because he talks about autism and how it is on the kind of responsibility is on the community to adjust for that person with autism. The difficulty is when you've got kids who need opposite things. And that's going to happen. You may have a young person who really wants to talk about their impairment, physical disability, or intellectual. You may have another young person who doesn't want to talk about it at all. So, when thinking through this, being able to have really honest conversations in your group and inviting people into that space of paying attention that they need, that they can actually be a blessing to the other. It means sometimes saying, we're going to have quiet times, or when it's loud, letting somebody who doesn't handle loud very well, saying, we're about to do a really loud activity. Can we stand outside with you while we wait for this one to pass? Because we want for you to be here, but we also want to do something that's good for everyone. What would you like to do? Again, we're back to that choice. I'm going to skip over a few things because I am very mindful of time, and I'm also looking at Senya's face, who's panicking. I'm going to say one quick thing on hope and lament. It's okay if kids say, I'm angry with God. It's okay if they say, why is my body doing this? Why did that happen to me? We don't lament if we don't know that something is wrong. I'm always a little nervous when young people stop lamenting, because then they have accepted that which should never have been. And hope can't take place if you aren't given a space to be able to lament. Part of this is also, I'm going to go back to this one. When we have a disabling world, when there is somebody with an impairment, being able to say out loud, that wound you've received, this way that you have been born, it's real and it's hard, but talk about it. Say it out loud. Not talking about things makes them seem scary and bigger than they are. But to speak the unspeakable lessens its power. When we see Jesus with his disciples and he's telling them, he doesn't tell them once or twice, he tells them repeatedly, by the way, things are going to get really hard. But he's also saying, and we're controlling this story. It doesn't have to be hidden. You don't have to pretend like everything's okay. We can hope when we know that we've said out loud and we've removed that power. I'm going to skip that. This picture here, quite frankly, is sometimes how I feel when I'm preparing to go do youth ministry or children's ministry with teens with disabilities. I share this picture because it doesn't seem very holy, does it? When you want to hide in your bed and put your pillow over your head and pretend like it's never going to happen. I share this because I think even as adults, we don't need to pretend like things are all perfect and right. What we do have to do is actually get out of bed, get a good cup of coffee or a cup of tea, and then be intentional about how we're going to be approaching the young people in our world. We want to have a good response so that we're not further harming, belittling, making fun of, or creating a space where people can't just deal with what's real. There's danger if we ignore our own capacity. I don't know how many of you are parents, but I do know all of you on here are interested in theology or ministry in some way, shape, or form. I am going to assume that perhaps you are holier than I am, but I have definitely had days where I have not been a very good mom. I was too tired. I was too hungry. I was too overwhelmed with projects, and I snapped at people. And I think, oh, that's not who I want to be, but I'm not sure how not to be that person. And it's embarrassing and it's frustrating. Now, importantly, when we have young people with disabilities, it isn't that they're not forgiving, but realize a lot of their world is people dismissing them or belittling them or being less than. We need to know our own capacity so that we don't end up either absorbing and being no use to them and they end up comforting us, or when we have compassion fatigue. I had shared a little bit with Roger earlier. I just took a group of teenagers on a trip, and I had more than one with special needs. And I could tell about day 4 of the trip, I needed a nap. Because when they were saying, let's play another game, let's do something else. What about this? What about that? And I thought we were having this profound, amazing Holy Spirit discussion. And I asked a question and they said, well, that was actually kind of boring. And I was like, how dare you think this is boring? We're doing amazing things. And I realized I needed a nap so that I could meet them where they were. Sometimes we need to actually take care of ourselves in order to do ministry well. This means you need to be able to have some rest, ideally to be able to restore yourself, and because margin matters. It means that you are taking care of yourself and you're modeling for the young people in your group self-care. It means that you need to see a counselor, or you need to do some breathing exercises, or you need to get a snack yourself. Don't try to be the hero. And then action for others. When you start down this road of working with anyone with disabilities, word will get out. And people will start saying, oh, I hear you're the person who's willing to have somebody who is maybe needing more attention or different attention. And then you will be asked to do more and more and more. And so you need to be able to know what is your own capacity and how do you build a team so that you can do what you're doing and do it well. I think I'm going to skip to one final thing, and then I do have a few other practical, but I want to leave the half hour for questions. There was a time, and we can look back at theology, when people with disabilities were not treated particularly well. Not only were they not included, but they were actually excluded or pushed out of the church. It's been about 30 years now where it's been a really, really concerted effort to have that conversation, but it moved from you're nowhere near to being able to say, well, maybe you can sit at the sidelines. And then it was, let's create a ministry that's specifically for you, but not integrated. And then it was, well, you can be in the same room with, but we're not going to adjust anything. And then it has shifted to ministry with those with disabilities. And then we know that there's true belonging when we start having ministry by. This is when I was saying, you may have somebody who's singing who has Down syndrome. Okay, so maybe they're not pitch perfect, but they're leading worship and it's brilliant. You may have somebody who's going to read scripture and maybe they stumble over a few of the words. It's okay. Invite them into spaces of actually serving, so that you can indeed invite them into those spaces of discipleship where they are honoring God, serving others, or building faith. I prepared way too much, which is not the worst thing in the world. But let me pause there, and then if I need to come back because there aren't enough questions, we can do that. But let me pause there. Questions? Let me go to the chat now so that I can.
Amy, that was so engaging and so personal and so you just were embracing this whole idea and embracing us with your words because you made it so practical. And I know we all say thank you. And I'll tell you, my song is from the Beatles. In the 19, I was a teenager when they came to America. And I want to hold your hand. I want to hold your hand. That's what they sang. And I wanted to hold Catherine's hand. That was my girlfriend. And so that song made me think of that. And so then Catherine and I, she took me to my first musical. I was a country boy who didn't want to go to musicals. I was more of a redneck who would sing all the country songs. And so she took me to My Fair Lady. My Fair Lady, my first musical. And I was with Catherine Kennedy. And that was so cool. I didn't marry Catherine Kennedy, but
But that song's there.
But that song is there. I want to hold your hand, and when I think of My Fair Lady, I think of my old high school girlfriend, Catherine. So there you are. But great job, Amy. You did a great job, and I know there are several questions and several comments that came up. One of the things that Alex asked about, and I had the same question. Maybe I'm confessing my problems. Is the word sin? I thought you had an interesting comment about the word sin and how you interpreted that. And could you unpack a bit more of what you meant by that as it relates to maybe young people or maybe to us as well, older people? When you said that sin, we would then become the center of the world, but really God should be the center. And maybe sin, we're missing the mark more than one way. Unpack the idea of sin.
Well, so I think one of the things that we have done, in particular, when we start looking at some of the doctrinal things, and we're talking about doing ministry with those with disabilities, it's often, here's what the church believes, but you're the exception. Well, that doesn't really make a lot of sense. And so one of the things that we know that there are these big picture things. And I would argue if somebody is made in the image of God, if we truly value them, if we really, really believe that God wants us all to be present, and I do, and again, be a whole other presentation if I did this just straight theology. But I think we do need to talk to young people about sin. I have two friends, both have cerebral palsy. One is a Black man who is in a wheelchair, born with cerebral palsy. Another is a white woman who is not in a wheelchair, but also has cerebral palsy. We have the conversations. And this is that part where if you know people with disabilities and you are privileged enough to get to hear their inside talk. I think yesterday somebody was talking about how they approach normies. So if you don't know this, if you do not have a disability, then when non-neurotypical or people with disabilities are around, they talk about us and they call us normies. So I'm just throwing that out there. But both of these friends have cerebral palsy. My friend who is African American, who is Black and in a wheelchair, people will often come up to him and say, "Oh, were you in a gang? Did you get shot?" Which is blatantly racist and really uncomfortable. And he gets to say things like, "I grew up in the church. I'm a pastor's son. Like, I'm about as straight-laced as you could ever be." He's also now in ministry. He's amazing. My friend who is a white woman, people will say, "Oh, goodness, you must never do anything wrong because you're such a wonderful, dear, caring person." And she will turn around and say, "Do you know how many times I got drunk as a kid or skipped out on school or did terrible things?" And she said, "But nobody would call me out on it because I had a disability." And she said, and then people would actually say to her, "Well, your life is already hard enough. you should be able to do whatever you want. That's trash. That's belittling to those with disabilities. If we don't want to actually treat people with disabilities as if they're human, then we need to get out of the business of ministry. That said, their disability is also not a sin. And that's a mistake the church has held in the past. But when we see in scripture and Jesus says, oh, that person is blind who sinned. Oh, wait a minute, no one. We need to be saying that out loud and repeatedly within congregations. If there is somebody, and it gets complicated because it can be that their disability could come from something like a drunk driving accident. There's probably some sin in that, but that's a separate case. When we are talking about impairments that have come from the environment, that have come from birth, there isn't a fault of sin that necessarily brought that. But what we do get to do is invite each person into being their best selves, which means we have to talk about sin. And there is no special dispensation just because you have a disability. Yeah, that's probably enough said there.
Well, one person mentioned on the sin issue, we'll move on to other questions, is can you differentiate between sin and disability? Are all sins disabling? You know, and where in Scripture, how do I say this? If a teenager is struggling with whatever issues, you know, be it some addiction, pornography, some lust issue, you know, do you say that's a disability? Vis-a-vis, is that a sin that is not a broken arm? It's not cerebral palsy. How do you, as a youth minister, differentiate between what may be a spiritual sin as opposed to other disabilities, or is spiritual sin a disability?
I am of the conviction that when we read in Psalm 139 that I am fearfully and wonderfully made, that we have people who are made who are non-neurotypical, who are a brilliant reflection of the image of God, and they have an impairment. I'm not going to equate behavioral or attitudinal actions that don't honor God, those sins, with an impairment. Though they can be disabling in that sense, I want to be really, really careful that we don't end up conflating some kid who's addicted to vaping with another young person who was born with cerebral palsy or who has acquired a disability in a war, through an accident, etc. So again, I think it would probably warrant a longer conversation.
Yeah.
But I want to be really, really careful that we're not saying a kid got drunk over the weekend and therefore they're disabling their relationship with God as being the same as a young person who is whose joints are breaking down and they're having to walk with or who has Down syndrome and is having to kind of think differently. Does that make sense?
Yeah. There's a lot of questions coming in. Cassina, you may have to help me, Cassina, with Marcia's question. I read it, but I'm not sure I understand it.
Yeah, there is a question from Marichka Andrushuk. She's our interpreter, so she cannot voice this question, but she is asking how to avoid feeling of guilt when taking a And remember that self-care is not selfish, especially when the burnout is looming, especially when faced with the pressure from others to continue in ministry.
Yeah. She's actually got several questions, so I'm like,
Yeah. The first one, the question I also wanted to thank you for pointing this out. Sorry, I can't wait for my question. We've talked a lot of this week about teaching able-bodied people how to be accepting and inclusive. We can rethink our own attitudes and be as us, have classes for adults, hold conversation with little children, and they're quite likely the most inclusive group as ACE. How do we approach tweens and teens to create those patient peers and friends?
I'm gonna work backwards and go with that first question. I think we have to do self-care, and I think most of us are rotten at it. How's that? And it's a worldwide kind of phenomenon. Every once in a while, I meet somebody who's really, really good at it. I happen to be a part of an international association for youth ministry. So I talk truly, probably every other week with friends who are in India or in South Africa or in the UK. So, and it doesn't seem to be any different anywhere. We're all over busy. But I think one of the things that we need to do is actually start living what we say we believe. I do practical theology, and so we talk a lot about here's your official theology and here's your functional theology. I think God is in control and can do anything. But I function like God needs my help and is going to fall apart if I'm not doing it. And so it may mean that we as adults need to be a little bit more mature. And it might mean that we need to talk ourselves through doing it well. We can't give well if we aren't in a good place ourselves. And what we now know through research, I do a lot on trauma-informed ministry as well. What we now know when we're looking at research is that between compassion fatigue and burnout, people stay in ministry and they end up harming others. The easiest analogy on the planet is the one that's about, when you're on an airplane. If you have somebody young or vulnerable next to you, please put your mask on first. Now that feels mean, like I'm going to take care of myself. You little toddler can't do it. But if I'm passed out, I can't help that small child, that person in need next to me. And so if you can keep that in mind, not to mention that Jesus napped. Jesus pulled away from people. He was like, listen, I like you people, but I'm going to go in a boat and get away from you because I need a little downtime. And so if we're going to take Ephesians 5:1 seriously, where it says that we're to be imitators of Christ as beloved children, then we actually need to live that out. And I would also argue that that means we need to be living a little bit more biblically and a little less worldly. We've gotten so caught up in being busy that we've forgotten how to just be present.
That's good, Amy. Two things. One person asked about the Search Institute, about Peter Benson. They wanted you to remind us about how to find that. Give us the, so just do that. And
I can drop that in the chat as we're talking.
Yeah, drop that in the chat if you would. They want to know the website for that. And also Paul, Yap, you have a question, Paul? You want a voice? Paul, are you there?
Yeah, I got a few questions. Which questions? I don't know whether I.
Okay.
Oh, that's not a question. Yeah. I mean, just ask whether is there such thing as spiritual disability? I mean, when we say disability, it's always disability is like inability to do something lah. Okay, it could be physical or mentally or intellectually. So if you are not able to be close to God, to be desired to be with God, do you consider that as a spiritual disability? Or is there such a thing called spiritual disability?
Fantastic question. And now I feel like I have a new research project. Thanks.
I mean, we don't talk about all these social, cultural
Yeah.
constructs.
Well, so I'm looking at the response. The person who's named Aleph Bait talks about alexithymia. If you aren't familiar with that, it really is that you don't quite know how to name feelings. And what people who have this, it's often somebody, if you can imagine, somebody on the autism spectrum is like, I don't know how to read people. And then you literally have to teach them, what are the cues? What's this face? What's this face? And that's part of inviting them into kind of the world to interact with one another. I would say the inability to be close or to desire God's presence. I honestly, I think I'm going to have to ponder that. And I can only remember when I was a kid, I knew that I knew God was real and God was at work in my life. But I remember vividly being in 9th grade and praying with my little friend Andrea while we were swimming. I don't know why, but we were both like, I know God's real. I know I should care, but I just don't. And my prayer was, Lord, help me to want you. Because I'm pretty happy right now. You know, I was 13 years old and hanging out in a swimming pool and just enjoying life. But the church I attended was like, if you are not desiring God at every moment, what is wrong with you? And I thought, well, I don't know. I'm 13. Maybe I like other things too. As an adult, I look back at that and I think, wow, it's really hard to desire something 24/7. I love my husband dearly. We've been married a long time, but I promise I do not spend every moment going, I hope I get to have more time with you. I just trust that I do. And there are moments where I'm like, oh, I just miss him. And it ebbs and flows. And I would argue that that's probably a more realistic, emotional kind of space. But I'm going to have to think about that. Thank you for that question.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. I think the Bible is probably full of people who were spiritually disabled. The Apostle Paul, and I'll give a preview. My lecture tomorrow is going to be on Naomi in the Old Testament, the book of Ruth, and she was spiritually disabled because of her grief. So, Paul, good question, and Amy,
Yeah.
good response. Many people are responding, Amy, how much they enjoyed your lecture, and that you were so disarming and so open and so vulnerable, willing to share yourself. Cassandra, how are we doing with our time?
I wanted to ask also one question.
Yeah.
It's the last one. I submitted in the chat. So sometimes when we work with the young people and kids, we invite them to participate in different ministries. But churches, they're not often ready to accept people with disabilities for leadership positions.
Mhm.
So the question is how to raise children and so that they are in some way prepared for the unjust world.
Yeah. Well, that's that part of that little teeter-totter that I had where I said hope and lament. I think we have to name it out loud, say it out loud, that those of us who believe deeply in this, we become the advocates. And even for our youngest ones, it's saying, when was the time when you felt sad or left out? And then saying, I've felt sad and left out before too. How did you handle it? Here's how I handle it. you know what? Sometimes I still need somebody to pray with me about this. Can you be my partner in us praying and inviting them to normalize that they can talk about it? But then it also means that when we hear people in our churches who are saying, I hate that person's voice, or it takes so long for them to just walk up front. Now we're back to John Swinton's conversation of becoming a friend of time. Really? Is it actually going to kill you if you have to wait 3 minutes for somebody to walk up front instead of them doing it in 30 seconds? But it might mean, and some of it you're going to have to work with your own personality. I am the person who from up front will say, we're going to have so-and-so come in who's going to read. And you know what's great about that? You get an extra 3 minutes of listening to me talk while she walks up. Isn't that great? And normalizing it and stopping some of the criticism ahead of time. Now, I'm also acutely aware I'm currently in some great spaces of leadership. I spent years, I will do a very, very quick snippet because I think we're not always in a great place. The seminary where I taught, and quite frankly, in a lot of institutions where I've been and churches, I used to say, can we do classes on ministry with teens with disabilities or people with disabilities? And what I was told repeatedly is, it makes people sad, and there's not enough of a market. There aren't enough people interested. And it made me mad. And so I thought, fine, you're not going to give me a class on this. I will weave it into every class. And so whether I was teaching systematics or homiletics or practical theology, I literally weave disability into every single subject. Now, I think that was actually a gift. I'm annoyed that they didn't value it enough early on, but it shifted my thinking. And when I am readjusting my thoughts, whether it be practical, what are the snacks I do, what are the games that I do to include people with disabilities, everybody is now included. Everybody belongs. When we rearrange and we stop accommodating someone, but instead we say, how do we design this from the beginning for everyone to be involved? But it also means that sometimes we're going to have to continue to be patient because not everybody is on board with this yet. But the fact that you're having a conference and you're having conversations, that alone is moving forward in this. So I wish I could say, how do you get the congregation on board? I don't know. But I just keep talking about it and keep doing it. And then sometimes when you're given the platform, you just do it, let somebody else get mad, but somebody else will be blessed.
Thank you, Amy. I think that everyone enjoyed to listen to you, and we see still lots of questions and comments. There is a comment also from Brian Brock. That's a great strategy, Amy, weaving disability into every course in your seminar teaching. Thanks for your lecture. We have also from Paul Yap comment of thank you, Amy, and from Ben Watson, thank you, Amy, for your lecture. I was particularly excited to hear about the two girls who worked together on their ministry project and together accomplished 2 ministries. I'm writing on this now, and you expanded my definition on ministry. Thank you. And I also wanted to finish with a comment from our colleague and a good friend, Denise Konduk, who wrote also a very good comment about your lecture, and I agree with him. I just tried to find it. Okay, these thoughts are down to earth, at simple, but also deep. Thank you, Amy. I think it can be applied to all people and can enrich any ministry. I appreciate your sense of humor too. So thank you, Amy, for being with us today. Thank you that you accepted this invitation. I was looking for a person who can speak on this topic. And I'm very thankful to our colleagues from the United Kingdom who just recommended to contact you, because that was a really wonderful lecture and we enjoyed spending time with you and listening to you. Thank you.